They wrapped the infant's body in gold, kissed his closed eyelids, and called him a god. But what they didn't tell you was who his parents were. His mother, also his aunt, his father, her brother. And that child, blessed by priests, adored by thousands, was already doomed. Because inside that gilded cradle wasn't divine perfection, but a ticking genetic time bomb. For centuries, the pharaohs of Egypt married their sisters, their daughters, even their own mothers, not in secret, not in shame, but as a sacred law, a holy tradition carved into stone and papyrus, their way of preserving the blood of the gods, and the very thing that nearly destroyed them. What could drive the most powerful rulers in history to such extremes? Was it love, madness, or something darker? And how many of their children born twisted, broken, or with monstrous urges had to be buried in silence? If your skin is crawling right now, you're not alone. Leave a comment. Because what you've heard so far, it's just the surface. What lies beneath is even more disturbing. This isn't just a story about incest. It's about power gone rotten, about the price of pretending to be gods. And once you see what happened behind those gilded palace walls, you'll never look at ancient Egypt the same way again. This is the story they never taught you in school. The story of cursed kings, shattered queens, and a royal bloodline that should have never existed. If you're ready to dive deeper into this dark truth, hit subscribe and share this video with someone brave enough to handle what comes next. Because things are about to get even worse. Ancient Egypt, land of the Nile, a civilization cloaked in gold, ruled by gods who bled red like men. To truly understand why Egyptian royals married their sisters, we need to travel back far beyond Cleopatra, past Ramses the Great, past even the pyramids. We arrive at the beginning of kingship itself. Around 3100 BCE, a warrior named Narmer united Upper and Lower Egypt, placing the double crown upon his head. From that moment on, the pharaoh was no longer just a ruler. He was divine. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally divine. To the people, the pharaoh was Horus in human form, descended from the gods, chosen by the heavens. His bloodline wasn't just noble, it was sacred, holy. To dilute it with common blood was unthinkable, unnatural, dangerous. So the solution in their eyes was obvious. If gods created gods, then the pharaoh must create heirs with someone of equal divinity. A sister, a daughter, a mother. After all, she too carried the blood of the gods. This wasn't a fringe custom or a one-time deviation. It became an institution, etched into dynastic law, reinforced by priests immortalized in stone reliefs and tomb walls. Pharaohs weren't just allowed to marry their sisters, they were expected to. It was a rite of power purity and eternal legitimacy. But this practice didn't spring from thin air. It was rooted in mythology. In the legend of Osiris and Isis, brother and sister, husband and wife, the divine couple who birthed Horus, the falcon god of kingship. Their sacred union became the ultimate justification for incest. If the gods did it, the pharaohs must follow. Over time, it became more than belief. It became necessity. By the time of the 18th dynasty, roughly 1500 BCE, Egypt was an empire. Its rulers commanded armies, built monuments that scraped the sky, and were worshipped across continents. Maintaining divine authority was everything. One slip in bloodline, one marriage outside the sacred loop, and rivals could claim the throne with a single accusation: impure. So pharaohs like Amenhotep I and Thutmose II married their sisters. Akhenaten, the heretic king who tried to erase Egypt's gods, took multiple daughters as wives. And then there was Tutankhamun, the boy king. His tomb was discovered nearly intact in 1922, glittering with unimaginable riches. But behind the golden mask lay a different kind of treasure: DNA. In 2010, genetic testing revealed what had long been suspected. Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister, his own wife, likely his half-sister. The result was a royal body riddled with defects: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, necrosis in the bones. He walked with a cane and died before reaching adulthood. This was not an isolated case. The royal bloodline had been shrinking, tightening like a noose with each generation. Marriages became fewer. Gene pools collapsed. Children were stillborn. Those who survived were often deformed, infertile, or mentally impaired. And yet, it continued. Why would they persist knowing the cost? Because power, true, unquestioned divine power, is addictive. The Pharaoh didn't just rule Egypt. He was Egypt. Every sunrise was his doing. Every Nile flood his mercy. To question his lineage was to question the gods. And so, despite the rot setting in the show, had to go on. The palace walls grew taller, the ceremonies grander. But behind the gold and incense, something was breaking. In private royal families hid their mistakes. Infants with no eyes. Children who could not speak. Queens who gave birth again and again to silence. The priests buried these secrets in unmarked tombs, wrote new names into official records, and erased others entirely. The illusion of perfection had to be maintained even as the dynasty decayed from within. By the time the Roman Empire took notice of Egypt, the royal bloodline had become a twisted, fragile relic. Cleopatra, famously seductive, famously doomed, was herself the product of generations of incest. Her family, the Ptolemies, continued the old traditions with obsessive rigor. Brother married sister, uncle married niece. And then, it all unraveled. But we're not there yet. Before collapse comes confrontation. Because, within the golden halls of Egypt's greatest dynasties, one decision a marriage made not for love, but legacy, would spark a chain of events more horrifying than any priest dared whisper. The gods were watching, and they were no longer pleased. She was beautiful, not in the way mortals are, but like something carved from ivory and smoke. Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten, half-sister and wife to Tutankhamun. And soon, if the court had its way, she would become the bride of another man, her own grandfather. It was not the first time she had been used. At just 13, she was forced to marry Tutankhamun, barely older than her. Their union had one purpose: keep the divine blood intact. She did what was expected, stood beside him in ceremonies, smiled through pain, and carried the weight of a kingdom on her narrow shoulders. But behind closed doors, all was not well. The royal couple had tried to produce an heir. Twice she had carried life inside her. Twice the children were stillborn, mummified fetuses, placed lovingly in their father's tomb. Their tiny limbs twisted, their skulls malformed. Silent proof that the blood of gods had turned against itself. Tutankhamun's health crumbled quickly. Some say it was malaria. Others blame the incest. His spine was curved, his foot shattered. He could barely walk, and his pain was constant. In his final days, he whispered to the priests of dreams, strange visions of his own body torn by the Nile of crocodiles with human eyes. Then he died, barely 19, and Egypt was left without an heir. Panic spread through the court like fire through dry papyrus. Who would rule? The line of Akhenaten was ending, too twisted, too broken to survive. But there was still one vessel left: Ankhesenamun. She was not just the last royal of pure blood. She was the key to legitimacy. Whoever married her could claim the throne. The high priests of Amun knew this. So did the generals. So did I. An old man with cold eyes, advisor to Akhenaten, vizier to Tutankhamun. And some whispered the true puppeteer behind the curtain. With the boy, king dead, moved swiftly. He declared himself pharaoh and married Ankhesenamun. She was no longer a queen. She was a pawn. Her face appeared on temple walls, smiling beside a man old enough to be her grandfather. But her eyes, they never smiled. In a desperate act of rebellion, Ankhesenamun wrote a letter. Not to her own court, not to the priests, but to a foreign enemy. The Hittites. I have no son, she wrote. My husband is dead. They say I must marry a servant. But I will never do so. Send me your son, and I will make him Pharaoh of Egypt. It was treason, it was madness, but it was real. The Hittite king, stunned, sent his son to Egypt. A foreign prince riding toward a crown drenched in centuries of sacred blood. But he never made it. The boy was assassinated before reaching the palace gates, likely by A's men. Akhenaten's message had been intercepted, her rebellion crushed. After that, she vanished from history. No records of her death. No known tomb. Just silence. Some say she was murdered. Others believe she was exiled, made to live out her days in a remote palace, as a broken vessel of a broken line. But her story did not die, because behind her, another child grew up in the shadow of those golden walls. His name was Seti, son of Ramses I, not of royal blood, but chosen by the gods in a different way. He would bring order. He would restore Egypt's power. But even he, like so many before, would not escape the curse of blood. As Seti rose to power, the same question haunted the palace: how to preserve the illusion of divinity without marrying within. The blood was already too thin, too fragile, but the people still expected gods. And so the cycle began again. Generals arranged marriages between cousins. Daughters were raised to marry their fathers. Even among those who knew the dangers, the deformities, the deaths, they obeyed. Because to disobey was to risk civil war. Legitimacy was everything, and legitimacy came from blood. But whispers grew louder. Priests noticed signs they could not ignore. Children born without tongues. Infants who could not breathe. Pharaohs who reigned for mere months before collapsing from unknown diseases. It was no longer coincidence, it was a pattern. And yet, they could not stop. To stop was to admit the gods had erred. And gods do not make mistakes. So instead, they built bigger temples, thicker walls. They filled tombs with more gold, more perfume, more spells. They buried their secrets deeper. But truth, no matter how tightly sealed, always leaks through the cracks. And one pharaoh would try to break the cycle. One man, born of royal blood but haunted by its cost, would challenge the very gods themselves. His name was Akhenaten, but his revolution would come with a price no one could imagine. His name still echoes in the ruins. Akhenaten, the heretic king, the one who dared to silence the gods. When he came to power, Egypt was already cracking. The priesthood of Amun had grown fat with wealth, wielding more influence than Pharaoh himself. The temples overflowed with offerings, gold, incense, blood. And yet the gods remained silent. Akhenaten saw it as rot. The old religion, the old ways had become a mask for corruption. He would tear it off. And so he turned away from the entire Egyptian pantheon and invented a new god, Aten, the sun disk. No face, no form, just light. To outsiders it was madness, but to Akhenaten it was purification. He didn't stop at changing religion. He changed the capital, abandoned Thebes, and built a brand new city in the desert, Akhenaten. A place where only Aten would be worshipped. A place without shadows, without lies. Or, so he claimed. But truth has a way of slipping through. In art, Akhenaten was portrayed unlike any king before him. Not strong and square-jawed, but elongated, almost alien. A thin neck, wide hips, distorted features. Some believed it was symbolic, meant to show divine uniqueness. Others whispered something darker, that the royal bloodline had finally reached the edge. Whatever the truth, the transformation was undeniable. He married Nefertiti, his cousin, possibly his half-sister. A woman of legendary beauty and sharp mind. Together they ruled as near equals, an image no Egyptian had seen before. Their children, all daughters, were raised in the light of Aten, pure, devoted, isolated. But behind the sun-drenched walls of Akhenaten, rumors grew like rot in a sealed tomb. Some claimed Akhenaten took one of his daughters as a second wife. That Nefertiti vanished not from illness, but from defiance. That the god Aten was not a source of purity, but of obsession. The court watched in silence. The people grew restless. Famine crept in. The temples of Amun, once silenced, began to stir. And Akhenaten, once seen as visionary, now looked like a man possessed. He withdrew from court life. Spoke only to priests of Aten. Wandered the palace in trance-like states. Some said he feared his own reflection. Others believed he spoke to the sun itself. But one thing was certain: his children were suffering. The royal daughters, once symbols of divine rebirth, began to disappear from records, one by one. The youngest, just a child, died without explanation. Another was never mentioned again. Only Akhenaten, the eldest, remained visibly at court, and even she bore the hollow eyes of a girl too aware of her family's curse. And then came the boy, Tutankhaten, heir to Akhenaten, son of who? No one knew for sure. Some said he was born of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Others whispered a more disturbing truth, that he was the child of Akhenaten and one of his own daughters. The bloodline had folded in on itself so many times records were either lost or intentionally erased. The boy was frail, sickly, but he had one thing no one else did: lineage. When Akhenaten died, suddenly without warning, the empire shuddered. Akhenaten, once a utopia of sun worship, was abandoned almost overnight. The priests of Amun surged back into power, and the boy king was dragged into their world. His name was changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. The god Aten was cast down, erased from temples, scratched off walls. The old gods returned, and so did the old ways, including incest. The court arranged for the young Tutankhamun to marry Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, or full sister. No one really knew anymore. What mattered was the blood, and that it stayed inside the same shrinking circle. He was crowned king, a child sitting on a throne of bones. Tutankhamun tried to rule, tried to restore balance, but his body would not allow it. He limped, he suffered. And by 19, he was dead, his body a brittle monument to a lineage stretched too far, twisted too tight. But Akhenaten's legacy didn't die with his son. The memory of his revolution, of turning against the gods, of isolating himself in golden walls, of possibly fathering children with his own children, became a stain on Egyptian history. One so deep later, pharaohs tried to erase him entirely. His name was chiseled out of stone, his statues buried, his city abandoned to the sand. But the damage had already been done. Akhenaten's story wasn't just the tale of a mad king. It was a scream in a sealed chamber, a warning etched in the bones of his heirs. The gods had been challenged, and now they wanted blood. The dynasty stumbled on, limping from ruler to ruler, each one carrying the weight of secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Seti, Ramses, Sipta, Merempta, names carved into history but always shadowed by deformity, by sickness, by whispers of the curse. In public, they built monuments to power, but in private they buried too many children, covered too many deaths, hid too many truths behind closed doors. And the people, they still bowed, still offered prayers, but the spark of divinity, the awe of kings, born from gods, was gone. Something had broken, and in time it would collapse. But before the dynasty fell, before foreign armies arrived, and Roman sandals trampled Egyptian sand, one last queen would rise from the ashes, the product of generations of incest, raised in blood, bred for power. Her name was Cleopatra, and her fate would echo every sin her ancestors tried to hide. She knew what she was. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was not just a queen. She was the living culmination of centuries of calculated bloodline manipulation. A daughter of incest, a ruler, born from rot, from ritual, from the unbreakable chain of gods marrying gods. And she carried it all in silence. Her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Greek monarchs who adopted the old customs of divine rule, and the old obsession with pure blood. Brother married sister. Uncle took niece. The royal family tree was not a tree at all. It was a knot, a web of tangled names looping endlessly around itself. Cleopatra's own parents, likely siblings. Her brothers, also her husbands. It wasn't a scandal, it was policy. But something in her had started to crack. She watched her brothers rot from the inside, one poisoned by ambition, the other drowned in his own arrogance. They were not kings. They were ghosts wearing crowns. And when it was her turn to rule, Cleopatra stepped out of the old myth. She didn't abandon it. No, she wore it like armor. But behind closed doors, she plotted something else: survival. The Roman Empire had arrived. Their ships lined the harbors. Their generals circled like lions. Egypt was no longer invincible, and Cleopatra knew that if she wanted her dynasty to live, she had to do what no Ptolemy had done before. Open the blood. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the West. She seduced him not just with beauty, but with language intellect and something far rarer danger. She bore him a son, Caesarion, half Roman, half Egyptian, a child outside the incestuous loop. But Rome would not accept it, nor would her own priests. They whispered that Caesarion was illegitimate, that the goddess Isis had not approved, that Cleopatra had tainted the line. And so the cycle resumed. When Caesar was assassinated, she turned to another Roman, Mark Antony, warrior, strategist, broken man. Together they tried to build a new empire, one that blended East and West myth and metal. But once again, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, and once again their blood was questioned. She returned to incest. Not with a brother, those were dead, but by marrying her own son to her daughter. The old ways refused to die. They clawed their way back, dragging Cleopatra with them. And in the shadows, Rome watched. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, saw Cleopatra as a threat. Not just as a woman, but as an idea. The East rising, the gods reborn. The bloodline that refused to die. He declared war. It was not a noble battle. It was a slaughter. The Roman navy crushed Egypt's fleet at Actium. Antony, betrayed and bleeding, fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, crowned in mourning, retreated to her tomb. She dressed in gold, wore the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, painted her eyes in the kohl of ancient queens, and waited. But death did not come swiftly. The Romans stormed the palace. Her guards fell. Her priests fled. The Nile ran dark. Octavian offered mercy, but only if she walked in chains through Rome, paraded like a conquered trophy. Cleopatra refused. She knew what it meant to lose. She had studied the scrolls. She had buried enough children, and so she reached for the asp. The serpent was sacred in Egypt, a symbol of divine protection, and in its bite Cleopatra found her final defiance. Not a scream, not a curse, just silence. When Octavian's men found her, she lay still, dressed in the robes of Isis, a mask of serenity on her face. At her side, two of her servants, also dead. It was the end of a bloodline, the end of a world. But what they didn't see, what they never understood, was what Cleopatra left behind. Caesarion, the last heir of the god kings. He was just 17. He had no throne, no crown, no army. Only a name. Ptolemy 15th, Philopator, Caesar. Son of Cleopatra. Son of Julius Caesar. Caesarion, the last pharaoh of Egypt. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he pretended to offer mercy. He sent word the boy would be spared, that he would be raised as a client king under Roman guidance. But it was a lie. Octavian was no fool. As long as Caesarion lived, the East would whisper of resurrection. The temples would never fully submit. There would always be one more priest, one more mother, one more zealot who believed the god kings would rise again. And Caesarion was too much, too perfect. His father was Rome's greatest general. His mother, Egypt's most powerful queen. His bloodline half imperial, half divine. He didn't just threaten Octavian's power. He threatened the idea of Rome itself. So they hunted him. Some say he tried to escape, that loyalists disguised him as a servant, that he made it to the Red Sea, that he wept when he saw the ships waiting. But he was betrayed, tricked by a message possibly forged by Octavian himself. Come, I will make you king. Caesarion returned. He was just 17. There was no trial, no ceremony, no public spectacle. They took him quietly behind palace walls. Some say he begged. Others claim he said nothing. That he held his mother's ring in his palm, pressed it to his chest, and closed his eyes. The execution was swift. Strangled, not stabbed, not crucified, a silent death. Erased as if he had never existed. His body was never recovered. And just like the 3,000 years of divine rule ended, not with fire, not with thunder, but with a whisper behind a locked door. Octavian became Augustus. Rome became an empire. And Egypt became its jewel, stripped of gods, bled of gold, and ruled from across the sea. But the blood didn't disappear. It lingered in legends, in rumors, in the strange afflictions that followed Rome's own emperors: madness, deformity, bloodlust. As if the curse had leapt across borders, finding new homes in marble palaces and iron thrones. Some historians point to inbreeding in Roman dynasties, Nero, Caligula, Elagabalus, as echoes of the same sickness that once consumed the pharaohs. Power, feeding on itself. Glory turned grotesque. But Egypt was different, because Egypt believed in eternity. They built tombs not for bones but for memory. And though they tried to erase Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, and Caesarion, the sand refused to forget. Centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed Tutankhamun's tomb, they found not just gold but grief. 2 tiny coffins buried beside him, his daughters, stillborn, twisted, wrapped in linen and silence. Even now, scientists peer into ancient DNA and find the damage. Fractured skulls, fused vertebrae, mutations born of incest and pride. Proof that the blood of gods was never meant to stay pure. And yet, the myth endures. Tourists still stand before statues of Ramses, gape at the face of Queen Tai, marvel at the beauty of Nefertiti. They see power, grandeur, eternity. But behind every perfect cheekbone is a lineage bound by iron tradition and poisoned by it. The incestuous bloodline of the pharaohs wasn't just a genetic tragedy. It was a political weapon, a sacred prison, a lie so powerful it lasted 3 millennia. And in the end it killed them all. The children, the queens, the kings, even the gods who sat silent as the thrones crumbled and the line of Ra turned to dust. All that remains now are bones and echoes. A golden mask hiding a broken skull, a painted tomb covering a twisted spine, and a serpent carved in stone forever poised to strike. History is cruel to those it can't explain. For nearly 2,000 years, Cleopatra's name was dragged through the dirt, called a temptress, a witch, a traitor to Rome. Tutankhamun was forgotten entirely. Akhenaten labeled a madman and chiseled out of the records. But time has a strange way of digging up what power tries to bury. In 1922, the boy king re-emerged from darkness. Howard Carter broke open the sealed tomb of Tutankhamun and gasped, gold everywhere, a mask glowing like the sun. But beneath the splendor lay something far more important to body. A deformed spine, a clubfoot, 2 mummified daughters by his side, and inside his chest a story no priest had dared write down. It was the first crack in the silence. Over the next century, archaeologists, geneticists, and historians would unearth more than treasures. They found a pattern, a system, and beneath it all, a tragedy. The royal family had not been mad. They had been trapped, locked inside a sacred lie told from birth that they were divine, and that to protect their throne they had to destroy themselves 1 generation at a time. Their children weren't cursed by the gods. They were sacrificed by their own blood. Today, we marvel at the architecture, the mummies, the crowns. But each monument is a gravestone. Each tomb is a whisper, a warning. That power, when made sacred, becomes impossible to question, and that unquestioned power can twist even love into something monstrous. The story of the pharaohs isn't just about incest. It's about what people will do to preserve an illusion. They built gods from their own flesh. And when that flesh broke, they called it destiny. They kept building, kept marrying, kept pretending, until the very thing they tried to protect, the bloodline of the gods, was gone. What remains today? Statues, inscriptions, DNA fragments. Some skeletons bear names, others don't. But all of them silent now, carried a weight that none of us can fully understand. And perhaps the saddest truth is this: the most powerful rulers of the ancient world, those who commanded rivers, built pyramids, reshaped time itself, could not escape their own traditions. They could defy death, but not their families, not their name. In museums around the world, their faces stare back at us, preserved, painted immortal. But what we often miss is the pain behind those eyes, the lineage behind the legend. Because eternity, when built on broken blood, comes at a price. And they paid it. 3,000 years. One royal bloodline. And a secret, so terrible it had to be buried beneath gold. If this story has left you speechless, you're not alone. The pharaohs were worshipped as gods, but what they lived through, what they did to preserve that power, is a warning that echoes through every palace and empire that followed. And if you think this was disturbing, wait until you meet the Pope who fathered children with his own daughter and turned the Vatican into a house of sin. That's not myth, that's history! Click here to uncover the unholy reign of Pope Alexander VI, where corruption, murder, and incest weren't whispered secrets, but sacred policy. And if you want more stories that history tried to erase, subscribe now. Because what we're about to dig up next might just change how you see the world forever.